iRefresh. I think we have a few new faces, and it's great to have each of you here. My name is Cheryl Clare, and I'm the one who founded this almost a decade from this fall. So it's a blessing to have you with us here tonight. I have a question. What is, if in your ideal world, if you had the greatest job, or maybe if you're in school, you're like getting all the best grades, get the best professors. If your life and your family, everything is streamlined, you are in the right lineage, everything is like perfection of everything in your mind that you dreamed of. That you had on social media, if you do social media, you had the highest follower rate amongst all of your friends. Or if you are an influencer, like the new trend today is called the influencer. That means you have so many followers that people take note of you. As a matter of fact, you can get jobs in Hollywood if you have a lot of people following you. Or it allows people to give you things so that you can get sponsored and showcase their product. In your ideal world, if you had all of the I wish I had, I dream I had, if you had all of that, do you realize that you would still not be exempt from having a hard time? We're not exempt from it. No matter what our perfect world in our mind's eye is, we're not. And I was reading recently and I just started to realize that there was someone in the Bible who had that. Who had like the ideal, like their family lineage line was in the priesthood. They were well honored in the community, well loved, accepted. Matter of fact, this couple's name is Zachariah and Elizabeth, and I began to look at their life, and all of a sudden I realized, you know what? We all can relate to someone like them, because you know what? Even though they had lives that they were well seen in their community. Matter of fact, Zachariah was a priest in the temple in Jerusalem, and he did his normal duties. Normal things that he had done, and priests back then could marry, and so not only had he married a woman, but he married someone who also was in the priest line. So her lineage line was where it was more acceptable. So it was like the prestige of prestige. Everything was great. And in Luke 1, that it says I'm just going to highlight things in Luke 1, which normally we talk about Jesus' birth, right, or the coming of his birth. But Zachariah and Elizabeth, their story was before that. They were the forerunners. And it said that with Zachariah and Elizabeth, that they were viewed by God to be good and just people in God's sight, walking with integrity. Even though they had everything that in that world at that time should have been great, they were honored. Even in the Message Bible it says, live honorably before God. And yet, in the seventh verse, it says, they were saddened. So even though life seemed good for them, even they were going through hard times. And they had sadness. I don't know about you, but sometimes there might be something great happen, you get some great new word, something happens good in your life. But I mean, doesn't it seem like it can change and shift so quickly by something else that you're believing for? Well, we know that Elizabeth, she was barren. So back in that time, that actually was a curse for women, especially because she was in the priest line, that it was not favored upon her well. She was not only barren, but it was a disgrace. How many of us have been labeled? Throughout all our lives, in different seasons of our life, we get labeled. And amongst those around us, loved ones or within our community of influence, we have been labeled. You're not good enough. You're not quite smart enough. You'll never amount to. You'll never get anything finished or complete. You'll never arrive. You're a dreamer. You just can't. You're average. You'll never just quite lose the amount of weight you want to. It'll never stick. You're a quitter, or you're just a loser. I think we all can say that we've experienced what Elizabeth experienced, and it was those labels. that brought sadness in her life. Because the one very important thing in women in that age was to bear a child, and she couldn't even do it. I wanted us to look at Elizabeth and Zechariah and realize that there is nothing that talks about them, and even no complaints. You don't ever see them complain or like, oh, why not God? Why wouldn't you? This God would take the pressure off. But you know what? They'd already gone past all that, and you still see how God viewed them as good. People of integrity. People that God honored. And yet, you're like, how could they have been honored? She couldn't give the one gift to her husband. And yet, Zechariah was faithful to his wife. And you can only imagine what they had to experience with her. And yet, this is what is interesting, that God, in the midst of all of that, and over many years, we realized one thing. I began to look at and started to read a little bit more on what was going on. Zechariah is a priest going through his normal duty, just living life faithfully. Verse 8 says, one day Zechariah was chosen to perform his priestly duties in God's presence. Position. Where was he? In God's presence, in the temple. Normal schedule, doing his normal thing. He had been selected from the priests by the customary procedure of casting lots for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to enter the sacred precincts of the temple. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense until you get a little example. Does anybody know what I mean by casting lots? Do you realize how easy life was back then when they were priests in the Old Testament? The priests all carried a bag. It's probably bigger than that, but this is what I got. This actually came from a friend from Jerusalem. And they had some kind of special things inside their little bag. And so when they needed to make a decision, like hear from God and make a decision, okay, so what would they do? They would take these things in here, and they would cast lots. And so they look and like, that's a yes. Okay, so now we have another question. Would life not be easier if all we get to do is oh God, what am I supposed to do? I don't know. Okay, I'm gonna cast my lot. That was so much easier. My decision's made, I get to go, right? Okay, so now, does it make sense now? Do you realize how hard and difficult that was? Here's a short story version. The priest, there were a whole lot of them. Back in the days of David, when they set everything in motion with the priests were divided into 24. And this was the lineage of the Levites. All right? So Aaron had two sons that didn't do anything bad, that were stale. Their lineage, their two sons, had all of these priests within their family over the years and the generations. So in those 24, they were divided out, all of the priests. And so every one of them had a duty every week, even at this point, at this time in the scriptures, that everybody had you know how they figured out what they're going to do each week? They cast lots. And then they had a scribe who would write down, okay, year scheduled for yada yada, all right? So this is what they did, all right? So they were casting the lots. But do you know how interesting it is? Okay, this is really cool. This is from an olive tree. This heart, isn't that cool? I don't think that's probably what they use for their lots, casting lots, but I just thought it was kind of fun. Okay, so, all right, so they casting lots. Now, all of a sudden, he is one of the people once in a lifetime. See, a priest, if they were able to go into this place to burn the incense, it was like the most ultimate that a priest could do. And not every time every priest got to do it in their lifetime. And if they did, they never got to do it again. That's why it says in the Voice version, it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. Now, when the lots were cast and he was one of those selected for that motion, do you realize there's actually 3 priests? Of the 3 priests, he was one of the 3. The ceremony, because they did in the morning and the evening, they'd burn incense, all right? And it was to give praise and worship to God. So the people who would be in the court, the men and women divided, and they would see the smoke, and they would be praying and worshiping God. Position. In God's presence, people are praying, worshiping, and praying to God, because this is also their atonement. They're forgiveness of sins, and they're giving thanks to the Lord, right? So they are praying outside, right? Zechariah gets to go in, and he gets to do the ultimate sacred moment. And at that moment, he goes in to the holy place to burn the incense. The incense was to go up as a sweet savor to the Lord God. All right? What happens in God's presence? All of a sudden, suddenly, a messenger comes. Well, Zacharias, I'm just doing my duties. This is my once in a lifetime opportunity. Who knew that Gabriel would show up? But not only that God positioned Zechariah even through casting of lots, but it says that he was positioned, the messenger was positioned to the right of the altar. Why is that? Okay, here's a couple examples. I'm going to give you notes later. One is example in Matthew 25:33, where it talks about when there's the dividing of the sheep and the goats, they put the sheep to the right and the goats to the left. In the tomb, what happens in the tomb? In Mark 16:5, in the tomb, where is the messenger, the person that's in the white robe sitting? It says to the right. When Jesus went up to heaven and he took his rightful place at the throne, where was Jesus positioned?
Right.
To the right. What is the right? It is the favor of God. It is our position to the right. And so the messenger came to the right for him to be able to declare to him this message. See, I'm going to try to do it without getting choked up. Okay, so Zacharias a little panicked. Like, oh, I didn't know this was the bonus. Yes, it's a bonus. You get to see the essence of the presence of God through the messenger. So he calms him down. He says, this is the beautiful thing I want us to see is the very first thing he tells him, it says, Zechariah, your prayers have been heard. That just resonates in my heart because I don't know about you, but I've been praying for some things for so many years.
Yes.
It takes a little bit to figure out how many decades, literally. I know you thought I was younger. But when I thought, oh my God, you actually set somebody in this pivotal moment to tell them your prayers are heard. What an encouragement is that God made a point of saying, I've heard your prayers. You've been faithful. You've been faithful. You're praying. So now, not only to say that your prayers have been heard, but he has so much more to tell him. This son, he says, you're going to have a son. Zacharias still in shock. Not only somebody showed up, now he's telling him something that's impossible because he's old, and so is his wife. And so now it's like, okay, you're not going to have a son. You're going to name him John, and he will bring you great joy and happiness. I'm not sure why it said joy and happiness. Maybe somebody can figure that out. You almost think they're intertwined, but joy and happiness, some things are consistent no matter what happens in the circumstances. There's an endless joy that God brings, not based on circumstances. And so John, no matter what would happen, there would be joy and happiness for you. And you know what's the next thing? He says, and many will share your joy at his birth. Do you celebrate with each other when something happens in someone else's life? I had someone share a message with me, and it has resonated over, now it's unfortunately been a couple of years. I feel like I'm just the testing of my faith. Is that I am to rejoice with other people when I'm believing for something in my own family. But when I see someone else, something great happen, I am to celebrate whatever happened in their life. Their prayers answered. It is for us to celebrate with them, not get jealous, not be envious, not like, well, why not me, God? Zechariah and Elizabeth did not do that. They did not complain and whine. They were always faithful. And look what God did. Not only would God give them just a child, but it said a great man. And that great man would do mighty things. And so Gabriel lays out what this is going to be. And so not only, he would basically be a Nazarite. Now there was only two other men at that time. Before that was Samuel and Samson would be a Nazarite. So no alcohol, and they would be pure and holy, showing the symbolism of God the Father, all right, that he would be so pure, because he had a plan that he would use John to be the forerunner of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. That is our hope, that he hears our prayers, and what does he have? It was suddenly that he appeared. Now, what happens? We need to understand, Zechariah doubted it. Listen, our unbelief, look what it did to him. His unbelief silenced him. My heart is that I will be so positioned in my heart to have the faith for everything. for the people around me. Even when I got a message this morning from a friend who just got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and they just opened her up and she goes, there was a second, it does not look good, but I'm fighting, and I believe. I believe. And so Zachariah didn't believe. He had doubts. And so he was silenced. Now, that doesn't mean that just because he made a mistake in his doubt, that was over, right? Thank you, Lord, that he is merciful. But you know what's kind of funny? Okay, so now Zachariah has to go outside. He's done with the burning of the incense. He comes out. Everybody's wondering, what took you so long? You were in there a long time. They know that there's a season and it's really short. What happened? And so he comes out, he's speechless. So he starts making noise like, okay, like, well, they think he's had a vision. I like those kind of cults, advertising like, yeah, I was so holy and whatever, and ta-da! I'm speechless, I can't say what happened. Well, it says that he grabbed his tablet. I kind of joked and I said, well, it was his iPad. He dropped, had to try to tell them what was going on. So anyway, he goes back to Elizabeth shortly after we know Elizabeth ends up bearing a child, or is pregnant. So, but the thing that is interesting too is she did not come out in public for 5 months. I'm like, why did she come out? She could come out. She was no longer under the disgrace because she wanted to make it obvious. I don't know about you, when I first got pregnant, I'm like, oh gosh, I had to do it. Back then, you wanted to make sure that it's obvious that you're pregnant because you hate when people ask you and you're like, you're not. You're like, so like, you gotta put those special clothes on, right? And you really don't want to ask somebody if you don't know. So Elizabeth stays under it for 5 months before she's going to go out in public. However, it's kind of funny though, when you kind of think about it. She says, I have lived with the disgrace, being barren for all these years. Now God has looked on me with favor. When I go out in public with my baby, I will not be disgraced any longer. That's our God. To this moment, we can realize, when we spend time with the Lord and say, Lord, this is how I've felt in my life. I have felt disgrace. I have felt shame. Something's happened. Sometimes we couldn't control it, and sometimes we couldn't. But now I know tonight, Lord, that you said that you removed that from me. You positioned me to receive, to know that you've heard my prayer, you heard my anguish. Amen. That I don't have to be in this place any longer because now I'm highly favored of the Lord. And this is Elizabeth. So now we know that after that, Mary has her encounter, and we're very familiar with that. I just want to highlight the part with Mary. She has the encounter with Gabriel. Gabriel's pretty busy talking to people, getting things going, got things to do, Messiah to come. And what he does, he uses Elizabeth to help Mary to make sure she believed and didn't doubt like Zachariah. And he uses her and says, it sounds impossible after he tells her you're going to have a child and you're going to, Holy Spirit is going to overshadow you. He says, it sounds impossible, but listen, your relative Elizabeth. Well, she's been able to bear children. She hasn't been able to bear children, and now she's far too old to be a mother. Yet, she has become pregnant as God willed it. Yes, in 3 months, she will have a son. So here's us to hear it. So the impossible is possible with God. The impossible of what you're thinking and believing for is possible with God. And that's what he had to say to Mary, and in humility accepted the calling. So now Mary goes and sees Elizabeth. This is what I find interesting. You don't see the dialogue completely, or you see the dialogue, but you don't see Elizabeth complaining, because as soon as Mary shows up at her door, it says in one version, it says, as soon as they heard, John in the room, as soon as she heard, John leaped in the womb, but they got filled with the Holy Spirit. And you're thinking, okay, so when you're pregnant, you want to tell everybody, okay, so she wants to tell her great news to Mary. But if you look at it, she spends her time being excited and rejoicing in Mary's behalf. and not looking at, well, poor me. Okay, I have a good story. Okay, yours ranks higher than mine. Okay. There wasn't that. There was that, not a sizing up, like, well, well, God did better for you than for me. You must be the favorite. I think sometimes women have to rise above that. I think even with social media, we have to rise above the comparison when people post stuff. And these things we're trying to do. Sometimes I post stuff when it's painful because I'm rejoicing with other, like my son's a baseball player, so I will post things and rejoice about other players while my son's on the bench. And I do it because I press through my disappointment and my sadness because I know what his heart is to play, and I know the ridicule he's had from other players. And yet for me, I'm going to rejoice, and I'm going to put my focus on the good things. And so Elizabeth, we see that she actually does that. And she's actually the first one who identifies the Savior. The very first one who exalts and says, my Lord. And she's speaking to the womb, right? I have to say, I have to admire Elizabeth. That she was so caught up in the good things and not the comparison. And she was excited, and she was excited for Mary as well. We can see something that happened in the two of them. Probably, can you imagine they had 3 months together and just talking about all the baby clothes and all of this and that? Okay, maybe not so much. But knowing that I could identify, because both of them were secluded. Think about it. Because of the disgrace that Mary would also is facing, right? But Elizabeth had already had so many years of disgrace. Think about how Mary could relate, or have Elizabeth relate to her and understand and have the sympathy to help her, to strengthen her own relative. I thought, God, you're so good that you did that so you could encourage each other for where they were at. And this is what I wanted us to look at in closure, in looking at their story. What will you do? We see that they remained faithful. No guarantees. They were already past the ability to have children. You didn't see that they were still like, okay, God failed us. Well, okay, we'll be faithful. You don't see that. But will we remain faithful even when we don't see the answers on our prayers? Will we be obedient? Will we honor God with our lips, with our actions? Will we trust God and know that He positions us in His time, in His favor? And know that He hears our prayers. And know that, you know what, there's a moment where it's going to be a suddenly. Even as in the way that God suddenly allowed Gabriel to speak to Zechariah. And in the midst, they worshiped and they prayed. I don't think I emphasize enough, but the people that were praying during that whole encounter, do you realize that? God surrounds people to pray, to prepare us for what God has for us. So why not celebrate? And the one thing we find out in the conclusion here in the scriptures where when John came, it is, Zechariah couldn't speak yet, right? So Elizabeth says, hey, the baby's going to be John. Well, they broke tradition. No, it's got to be Zechariah or somebody in your family. And so then they looked at Zechariah in shock, like, this is not going to be. And at that moment, Zechariah got the iPad and said, John. And at that moment, he then could speak. And in his speaking, what was his first thing he did? He thanked the Lord. He thanked God. And he had a beautiful, beautiful way of just praising God. Now watch what happened. Because of his actions, it said it influenced the community and it all went out to where it changed and shifted the atmosphere. Here he became an influencer because he was rejoicing in what God had just done for him and Elizabeth. That's what God has for you. He's got great things for you. Stay the course, believe what God has for you because He's positioning you to the right for His favor and His timing when He does it where it's not possible for you to do it on your own strength and your own abilities. It's only when He can look and say, only I can do it, so that I will get the glory. That is His heart for you. He's not a cruel God. He's a mighty God that's working all the details in your life for such a time for you to realize His mercies and goodness to you. He is faithful. And we have an opportunity to praise God through it all.